when you book. So we're all like,
I love that stuff. Like
every time we took a test, it was an open book test.
That's the best one.
And she did it to boost her numbers, which it works, because technically we all did take the test. Well, and what was even sillier about it was we got more.
Oh, are they? Do you take any kind of medication?
Everybody does off like the just in the class situation. So she would go like, okay, give it to your friend, and they'll break the paper.
Does the
Your friend
barometric pressure change? Is that SCPD?
But everybody would just literally cry.
You don't feel anything?
Answers and then hand it down. And you would, everybody had
It's wet outside.
because everybody kept correcting the answers.
I know it's getting something like.
No, gee.
I really hope I always had teachers like that.
You got fired.
I guarantee it.
Some women, it just knocks it out.
It's just like,
Gives them cute eyes.
Well, I mean, like the online class that I got, they have to show me because we take an exam.
Well, you know. Okay, we're going to go ahead and begin. It seems like the rain has kept some of our friends away. Glad to see everyone who's able to be here this evening. We are going to be continuing a discussion that we carried on last week. We're going to finish that up a little bit, and just given some time, I was able to look into a couple of things just to maybe re-verify or at least consider some possibilities on stuff. But tonight we're going to be looking into conveniences, is how it's titled on the page, but really we're looking at the idea of commands. How do we know if we have leeway on how we are to perform the command, as opposed to there is no room for any kind of thought on how we go about completing it? But we'll talk about that more here in just a second. Let's start with a word of prayer, and then we will begin our lesson. David Saunders is not here. Can you lead us in prayer?
Father, we thank you for today. We thank you for the opportunity. We thank you, Father, that we have the word to study. We know that it's pure, it's from you, that things that you said and written in your word, things that we can live by, teach others about your way of life. We thank you, Father, for your Son Jesus, who died for us on the cross. We thank you, Father, for his great example and for his teachings. We pray, Father, you be with us in this study. Continue to learn more to help us in our journey here on earth as we strive to live for you, and hopefully, Father, we hopefully stay faithful, live this life the way you want us to, so that we can have a better life. Pray, Father, you be with us, be with those who are not here. Be with us for this week. That's my prayer.
Amen. If you open your Bible to Romans 14, we're going to start there in just a moment. Romans 14. What we're looking at is really the core component of what does it mean to keep the commands of God. There are some very straightforward ideas about this, and there are things that require a little bit more conversation. Romans 14 is one of those texts that a lot of people go to either to justify what they do, or it could be something sinful. They're trying to justify something that's sinful. But Romans 14 is also there in light of who in here celebrates birthdays? Or who used to celebrate birthdays? I guess that depends. Okay. Is anybody against birthdays? At least in this room? Okay, there's some people who are against birthdays. Nothing wrong with that. Romans 14 would be a chapter to look at for that. One man esteems a day better than another. Someone will try to say, well, I guess that means we don't have to come together on the first day of the week. No, that is a violation of Romans 14. We're looking at matters of opinion in Romans 14. And sometimes some of those matters of opinion come to things like, what color should the carpet in the building be? Should we meet in a building or like a designated church building or meet at someone's house? Should we rent out a location? for worship assembly. And people have that right to make that decision. As long as they're coming together and they're worshiping on the first day of the week and or any other time that the leadership would esteem, okay, we need more spiritual nourishment. What's another time we can do this so we can gather together as a congregation? They have every right to do that according to 1 Peter 5. What Romans 14 deals with is this matter of opinions. And I want you to notice in verse number 1 and 2, let's just do 1, 2, and 3. Receive one who is weak in the faith, but not to disputes over doubtful things. That word there for doubtful is matters of opinion. For one believes he may eat all things, and he who is weak eats only vegetables. Let not him who eats meat despises him who does not eat. And let not him who does not eat judge him who eats, for God has received him. If I choose to abstain from certain foods, and some people love that kind of food, they really have no right to look at me and say, well, you're just a weak individual. Well, I hate mushrooms. That's just me. I don't like mushrooms. I'm not allergic to them. I just think they're gross, so I don't eat them. I don't like olives either, but some of you probably do like olives. But even in this context, Paul is saying some of the brethren were taking people who eat everything and people who were vegetarians, and they were making fun or saying that God's not going to receive you because you're not eating what we eat. What if somebody today wants to try the Old Testament dietary laws? They just want to try it out. They know it's not binding, but they just want to try it out, and they find out that it works really well for their body. Do we have a right to say what they're doing is wrong? No, it is a choice. It's an everyday choice. Now, this again deals with, notice again, verse number 1, opinionated things, doubtful things. This is not saying that when we have discussions over like the 5 acts of worship that we practice on a Sunday basis, how are we going to go about doing that? So like I think for a while we were doing song, and then we did the Lord's Supper. Immediately after the Lord's Supper, there was the collection, and we had 2 people down here. Then we changed that to, we have a song, we have the Lord's Supper observance, we have another song, then we have the collection. And then we changed that again to modify, to make it a little bit more reverential, give people time to think. We have someone who presides and says a few words before we partake of the Lord's Supper. And 2 other individuals go out and give the Lord's Supper to other individuals. They come back. There's another prayer that's said for the cup. Those 2 individuals up front, they go and serve the rest of the congregation. They come back. Then we have, for sake of convenience of time, then we have a prayer for the collection. Those are kind of things we're doing the observation. But the manner by which we do that, there's a couple of things that are just matters of opinion in that resort. Could we do Lord's Supper followed immediately by collection and just do one prayer for all of those? I mean, some people may say you're trying to combine it at that time, but if that's what they feel like, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. If someone wanted to do a specific prayer for the Lord's Supper, observe the Lord's Supper bread, and then the cup, and then you have another prayer for the collection. The collection is not passed around, the collection is taken. Well, that even sounds like it's being stolen too. But anything wrong with that? That's what Romans 14 deals with. And that's kind of what we want to talk about this evening. Now, this discussion is not to say that if we have differing views in sense of the particulars, how to go about this. I'm not talking about the thus saith the Lord, these are the absolutes. But if we have discussion over the particulars, these are things we need to have conversations over. There are a lot of individuals who, when you begin to talk about the particulars of worship, now I'm just talking about in the broad stroke of things, does God have commandments as to what we are to do in worship under the New Testament law? Yes, He does. A lot of people don't like to hear that. Is there really only one church, or are all churches just as good as another? Well, when I look into the New Testament, it tells me there's one body. There's one head over the church. That's Jesus. And all churches must worship the way that He's designated under the New Testament. That's not up for discussion. But there's people who think that that's even being way too legalistic and you're binding things that aren't being bound. But then there's a little bit more confusion that starts to come in. What if you have a congregation who they have prayer in the Sunday assembly, they have singing in the Sunday assembly, they have the Lord's Supper observance on Sunday, they've got teaching, they got the lesson, but they don't actually do the collection during the assembly. What they actually do is they say, if you scan this QR code, you can submit your payment through PayPal to the church treasury. Is that still giving? Yeah, that is a form of giving. Not really one that we do or anybody in the area does, but that is a form of giving. I know of a couple congregations down in Middle Tennessee who do that, and some even out of state that do that. They're still partaking of giving on the first day of the week. So these matters of opinion, when I'm saying this, we need to be very careful. This isn't just trying to belittle or badger anyone in anything that we say, but we need to be open to these kind of discussions to make sure that we're of the same mind and of the same judgment. Philip.
Well, that form of collection that you just mentioned is like having church service on Facebook or YouTube. Some people don't have that ability to see that service.
That is correct. Now you're talking about the difference between someone giving on the first day of the week through an electronic means versus an individual who's trying to substitute worship assembly as a whole on the first day of the week. What I'm
saying is some people, not everybody's got a cell phone.
Oh yeah, definitely. Definitely, which is why we've got to be on the same ground. It's why every congregation is different. The elders of the congregation, or at least the leaders of the congregation, if they don't have elders, the men of the congregation, their job is to make sure that the congregation, wherever it is spiritually fed as the Bible dictates. They are to be fed spiritually. So that could be, maybe you have a technologically illiterate congregation. Nothing wrong with that. They're just not that great with technology. That's okay. What if we just did it exactly the way, in person, and we did everything the way they did in the first century? Well, there's no problem there. What if you have a congregation that's more in an upstate type area, it's in the city, and you've got more people who are more into technology, and they're able to do different things that still fulfill the commandment, but it tends to the needs of the congregation. Same thing, it's still providing the spiritual needs. So yeah, you're absolutely right. We need to keep that in mind as we make these kind of decisions and choices, and that's a really good point.
Give them the opportunity not to fulfill 1 Corinthians 16 by giving them the first day of the week, because they can say, well, I don't have time right now. I want to submit my contribution Monday or Tuesday.
Oh, now that would be a violation.
So you open up the door for them to be a little bit lax on what day they actually give.
Yes. Now, I don't want to talk about that too much because that's actually Sunday. How we become ungrateful and then we fall behind in things. So it can actually lead to, and that's one of the decision makers of a lot of things with technology, like will that actually make us lazy? You look at Israel's story, when God gave them something and it helped bring a convenience in their life, normally we see them kind of going backsliding. Well, that happens today as well, so that's a really good point. So a lot of congregations don't have it because people would turn in their collection late, which it was late, but it's still due on the first day of the week. That's Bible. That's a good point. So what we were looking at the three components whenever we're looking at this question of how do we keep the commandments of God. We looked at the core aspects of looking at faith. We looked at Romans 10, and we looked at Hebrews chapter 11. Faith instructs, it informs, it teaches us how we can be redeemed, it teaches us how we can be servants of God, and how we can continue being sanctified before God. So if I look at the idea of how I am to be saved, how I am to serve, and how I am to continue, we're passing out sweet things in class. Nothing wrong with that, but he's just smiling at me. That's all it is. He gave away your secrets, Mark. But what we're looking at are three core components of the commands. Is we're looking at what are the components of what's under consideration. So like we were talking about Lord's Supper last week, the idea of the emblems, the components of the Lord's Supper is the bread and the cup and the individual who's participating in that remembrance supper. So what are some of the components that make up what's under consideration? Number two, what is going to help us to complete the command that's been given? Referencing back to what sparked this whole thing, when you look at Noah's story in Genesis 6 and 7, when he's building the ark, it never tells us what tools he uses to build the ark. It just says that he built the ark. He did all that God had commanded him to do. Do you think that he took the pitch or the tar-type substance? Do you think that maybe he took his own hands and he wiped that pitch on the ark? He could have. That wouldn't be wise, but he could have. What if he used a little stick to get the pitch, and he used a little stick to help smear the pitch all over the ark? Is there anything wrong with that method as opposed to using your hand? No, and that's kind of what sparked this. So what are some of the things that are absolutely necessary to complete what has been commanded? And then we'll also look on a flip side, what are some things that can be used to help to complete the command that's been given? And then lastly, we'll look at some compromises of what is absolutely not keeping the command, which, I mean, by the way, just looking at the title screen, I mean, cheating our way or lacking in what God commands, that's obviously wrong. Or claiming to fulfill God's commands like Acts chapter 5 and actually lying about keeping it because we're saying that we're giving more, but we're actually giving less, that's obviously a violation of God's command. Even changing the command, clearly violation of command, or even that of compromise. Just change some of the things that he says, I want you to use this, or I want you to do this. Well, again, that's not right. So some of those things are kind of, okay, that's a no-brainer. But then if we start looking deeper into that, at what point does it suddenly begin, okay, now we've hit the doubtful things or the things of opinion where if you do that, that's not wrong in and of itself, but maybe it could be thought as an opinion, as we'll see here in a moment for one argument, but really it's not. You're actually compromising or changing the law. So we're going to be looking at some of those particulars. We looked at the Lord's Supper. Again, we looked at the bread, representing the body of Christ, and the cup, meaning the blood of Christ. Now, there was a point that was brought up last week, and I thought it was good. I looked at it a couple of different ways because I was trying to see, is this really something that is here's the core aspect of it. In Matthew and Luke and 1 Corinthians 10 and 1 Corinthians 11, well, really in all the cases, so also including Mark 14, there are what's called imperative verbs. Now, an imperative statement in English is just simply a sentence that is a command. When I look across the initiation of the Lord's Supper, there are two distinct commands regarding the emblems. So the bread and the cup. And we talked about the cup is using a figure of speech because we're not drinking a cup, we're drinking the contents within the cup, which is the fruit of the vine. That's what's designated. But I started looking at the idea is the concept that one must break bread in the observance of the Lord's Supper. And I was trying to look at it in many, many ways to see, okay, is this an implied action? Is this something else? Because, well, we'll get to that here in a second. When I looked at what Jesus would say, there were two distinct things he would say. Take, eat. Now, if a sentence begins with a verb, that is in language, there is the implied you statement. So you take and eat. This is my body, which is given for, or some of the Gospels would say, which is broken for you. That's the command. Number one, you take and eat. The second command is you do this. Hold on. Yeah. You do this and drink the cup. Well, that's the fruit of the vine. Those two imperative statements, those commands, is what Jesus gives, and even gives a timeline for this. Do this in remembrance of me, for I long to partake of this when I am with you in my kingdom. And he's talking about in the final day, because Jesus isn't partaking of that feast with us. But there's another text that gives me the absolutes as to here is the mandatory aspect of this remembrance supper. I want you to look over in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, and what we find from this text, beginning in verse 24, we talked about this last week. It uses in every single case for the bread for the Gospels in Matthew 26, Mark 14, Luke 22. It always says, do this in remembrance of me. But it never says that in the cup or with the cup in every one of the Gospel accounts. Well, Paul includes when Jesus broke the bread and he gave it to them and he said, take, eat, this is the bread which is my body broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me. When he gives the same statement about the cup in verse 25, he would say, take this and drink this cup and do this in remembrance of me. Well, Paul adds an extra, do this in remembrance of me. So did Jesus say it or did he not? Paul's giving me more context as to what's going on during that night. Look at verse 26. When Paul gets to the conclusion of the matter of what we are to do, here are the absolutes in partaking of the Lord's Supper. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death till he comes. The importance of this supper is the supper itself, the body broken for me and the blood that was shed for me. Now, are there particulars as to, because we talked about the individual pieces versus the sheets of bread versus what they would use in the first century was unleavened loaves is what they would have, and they would just break off of that loaf and they would pass it around the room. Well, we have it in a collection plate, or well, really a serving plate. So which one's right? Yes. That's the answer. Paul is saying in enacting this, there are three main things to keep in mind. You are partaking of the bread, you are partaking of the blood, but also in examining yourself. If you look at verse 27 to verse number 30, Paul would say, let a man, when he partakes of this, examine himself. Don't take it in an unworthy manner. Now, this is one of two ways, which this is one of the commands where if you're not a Christian and you do this, you're sinning in doing this. But if you don't partake of this meal, you are sinning by not partaking of the meal. So the only way to clear the guilt from either taking it or not taking it as a Christian is to become a Christian. That's the only way you can take it in a manner which is worthy, because you're failing to remember the one who gave his life for you. Doesn't mean you're necessarily accepted in doing that. That's like if I were to worship God in any other way than what he commands, he doesn't approve of that. Well, God says all people must partake of this. But if you take it in an unworthy manner, you're sinning. So that applies to the Christian and the non-Christian in doing that. If someone wants to say, well, it doesn't apply, well, then what happens if you have two non-Christians who marry? Is it a marriage in the eyes of God? Yeah, it is. God instituted marriage. So there are some commands that apply to the broad spectrum of everybody must do this. Doesn't necessarily mean everything is right in how they do it. But when I look at what Christians are to do, here's the command. Partake of the Lord's Supper. This is the bread. This is the cup. In doing the example, how often we are to take this. Now, get this. Has anybody ever gone to one of those Easter Mass things or Christmas celebrations that take place on a day other than Sunday? I don't know if you're saying you have or... Oh, okay. I was like, you haven't gone? I'll get you here in a second, Jacob. Did you know that it doesn't say that they partook the Lord's Supper on a different day other than the first day of the week? You don't find that anywhere else. So what happens if you partake of the Lord's Supper on a day different than the first day of the week? How's that any different than, oh, I forgot to Venmo my collection. I'll just do it on Tuesday. It says lay by in store on the first day of the week and give. So when I look at the day, I can't change that. And even a holiday isn't necessarily going to change that, but let's look at the word holiday. Holy day. First day of the week sounds like a holy day, doesn't it? That's the Lord's day. So I can't change the example that I find of the apostles and the disciples coming together on the first day of the week. But also important is the examination of myself. If I'm having problems in my life and I'm sinning against God and I choose to partake of the Lord's Supper anyways, it says I'm sinning against myself. I'm sinning against God. But if I make things right with God and I'm focusing on Him, then I'm doing it in a manner which is well-pleasing to Him. Jacob. Because they are to partake of that supper. And if you don't partake of the supper, which represents He died for you and He's redeemed you, then you're sinning by not partaking of that. Correct. Now, are we implying there are normal circumstances involved? So I'm saying, like, if I'm planning on going to services, and Philip, I'm going to twist your deer story just a little bit. I'm driving to services, and lo and behold, a whole family of deer slam into the front end of my car. I black out. I'm unconscious for 5 days. What's God going to do about that? So if we're talking about normal circumstances, yeah, that's what's under consideration. If I'm talking about stuff way beyond my control, a whole nother ballpark. Yes, because they're taking it in a manner which is unworthy. So what and this has happened before. It actually happened this Sunday and the previous Sunday and the Sunday before that. What happens if we have a visitor and we're passing around the Lord's Supper and they decide to partake of it and we say, no. Does that mean when we're singing together in the assembly, I said, no, you can't do that. You don't have the right. What that ends up doing, there comes a part when people are learning about the Lord, they'll start to put the pieces together to find out, okay, this is what I need to do. This is what God's people do in the Bible. Then there comes a moment as they're doing those things, I'm not actually been accepted by God in any of these things that I've done. So what do I need to do? Well, I need to become a child of God so that I can take these things in an acceptable means. So if I'm going to say, well, no, they can't partake of the Lord's Supper, then I got to be consistent all across the board. You can't do anything. Now, if you do that in today's setting, what's going to happen to them when all they're told is, no, you can't, no, you can't, no, you can't, no, you can't? They're going to go somewhere else. So we've got to teach them as they go through that. But if they want to take that because in their mind they're thinking, well, I need to take this, well, that's great. But in God's perspective, there's still a little bit more learning you got to do. But if they also refuse to take it, honor that as well, but it doesn't necessarily mean that's right. But that's a good point. It's good. It's good. Philip. Okay, there's a couple of different levels to your question. Me and Calvin used to go with Dad on Sunday afternoons, and we would go to either nursing homes or we'd also go to someone who was sick or maybe a shut-in. We'd go do a small devotional type thing with them and help them to partake of the Lord's Supper. And from talking with other people at the school, they also experienced the same thing as they were growing up in some cases. But not every congregation does that. Now, with that said, the act of doing that is supposed to be showing consideration for others who are unable to be there. In that case, that is a wonderful thing to do. Mandatory? No, but with that said, if I feel like I shouldn't have to go and check on anybody who's shut in, then how am I really fulfilling a Matthew 25 thing? I was sick and you visited me. But also, when I consider principles from the book of Proverbs, I believe it talks about in Proverbs 24, 11, and 12, if you see someone sinning, which, I mean, if they're shut in, that's one of those things we were talking about with Jacob. You can't control that. But I can make a way to be able to help them to be able to worship God on the first day of the week. That would be the route where I'd be thinking that is absolutely what is necessary. And if I'm esteeming others better than myself, then yeah, I would definitely do that. You're sick, I would go out and do that. Now, with that said, that is something I believe is a wonderful practice. I've not done that in a while, but that's a wonderful practice and probably something that would be something good to do again on Sundays, just so we can make sure that whoever's not here and is sick, they have a means to partake of the Lord's Supper. There's another workaround that this isn't saying this is preferred, but if you have someone who's really anxious of having people around them, and we've got two that I know of who have told me they don't feel really comfortable around people. It's not that they don't like them, it's just that they're at a point in life where if they catch something, they're going to die because they have no immune system. They've taken communion cups that they say, I take this on Sundays, and that is my observance of the Lord's Supper. But normally on Sundays, they're feeling terrible, so their body's going out of whack. Both of those options are good. But yeah, I believe you're right. That is a wonderful practice, and it shows others that you do care. So yeah, unfortunately, that's starting to become more old hat. That's like the little portable communion boxes that they would carry around. I believe we've got one or two in the back, I believe. That's interesting. I'll talk to you more afterward. That's actually a really good thought. I recall maybe only one person we went to who she had dementia, and eventually she just forgot about it. But at that point, I wasn't really questioning, like, why are we doing this? We just thought, oh man, I don't get to play games. I have to go to the nursing home, was my mindset. But that's a really good practice. I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, they should be offered that because you can't really examine yourself if you have no idea what's going on as you're doing it. So that would be when I pray with the understanding. When I sing with the understanding also. That also applies to our worship. That's a good point. Okay. No.
There's 5 acts of worship. To truly worship God, you have to do those 5 acts of worship. Well, me, and I thought about this, thinking the Lord's Supper is only one of those acts, but they're not really a worship. So, I just really wondered if it's really got any religious significance.
Oh, you mean by going?
Yeah, they're just taking the Lord's Supper. See, there's 4 other things they haven't done like that.
Oh yeah, yeah.
You could go and have prayer.
I didn't mention that a while ago, and I should have. That the men did that. They sung songs, they had prayer, and they read the scripture to the person. Then it wasn't just the fact that here's the Lord's Supper, take it, you're done.
Okay, so that's a good point. So yeah, well, now I've got to review my life. Later in life, in college years, they used to have like 2 o'clock at the, they call it the Waters. It was a Christian nursing home, but they would do like a little 30-minute devotional type worship service. They'd sing songs. There'd be the Lord's Supper. They would have the collection, but they would also understand we don't want to take advantage of people who are impounded here, which that's not the right term. I'm saying that in joking. But yeah, in partaking all 5 of those, it's not just Lord's Supper. So that's right. Really good points.
Giving was one part of that too.
Yeah.
So they should, if they do all 5, then that person has to give contribution as well.
That's right. That's good.
I think back on it, maybe that's what Mom asked me what I was doing when I was trying to sing.
Speaking of singing, that's a really good point. Was that a compliment or saying, why do you burden me so? Oh my. The other one was singing. There are some brethren, well, okay, I don't want to phrase it that way. There have been questions over the past couple of decades, and there's just been individual talk where people understand the concept of Ephesians 5:19 and Colossians 3:16, but also I would apply with that 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 15. There's an important reason why to include that verse along with these other 2. So we've got the speaking to one another in psalms, hymns, spiritual songs, singing, making melody in your heart to the Lord. And then we've got let the Spirit of God dwell in you richly with all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, making grace in your hearts to the Lord. Now, both of those are passages that are very clear point on the idea of singing, but 1 Corinthians 14, verse 15 is very specific because of the context that's involved in 1 Corinthians 14. Yes. Which one? Oh, okay. We're going to talk about the components, and the reason I broke it down this way, there is something that comes up over and over and over again in all of these things. So if I look at ignore the mime for a moment, I forgot to hide that, but that is important. When we look at what, so if I'm asking what genre of music I need to be picking, they didn't have what was called religious music, or at least, now that's what I call the Hymns of David, Album 5. They didn't have that. Actually, I don't even know what they would have had if they had a vinyl equivalent. But it would say psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. Now, there's specific concepts with those. Most people tend to separate it this way. Psalms are exact verbal renderings of the biblical text. Exact verbal renderings of the biblical text. Some would even say it's pulled directly from the Psalms, both of which I can't say yay or nay, but they are psalms in the nature of the biblical text. Hymns are spiritually oriented songs, but they're not necessarily a word-for-word verbatim of the biblical text. It's a concept of the Bible, but it's not exactly the verbiage that is the biblical text. So that would be a hymn. Spiritual songs would be the idea of a call and response type thing. So we've got humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, humble yourselves in the sight, and the men and women would switch spots. That's just called antiphony music or antiphonal music. You've got a call, you got a response, you got a call and response. We see that in Exodus 15 with the Song of Moses. That's how that song was laid out. Not saying that is our model. So it gives me the what I am to sing. Now, how I am to do that. When I look at Ephesians 5:19, it talks about the voice. In fact, it would say the idea that we are to speak to one another in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. I can't speak with a mechanical instrument. You know, someone would say, man, he's really talking with that guitar. And I get what he means when he says that. He's playing like Kenny G on whatever instrument he's playing on. Man, he can really make that sing. Well, with the voice, and even Paul would say, I pray with the understanding. How do you pray? With like here's Siri going to pray for me, or I have to use my voice. It could be an internal thing. I understand there's different aspects of prayer. But what about singing? Paul said, I will sing with the understanding also. Guess what he had to use to do that? Voice. Secondly, I find another component that deals with voice. This is that of teaching one another. Now, songs have a way of compelling people to have feelings. That is the nature of music. Just sounds kind of trigger certain ideas and feelings, and that's okay. But the idea of teaching, it requires my voice. But I also want you to notice as well, in both Colossians and Ephesians, it talks about singing, but also this idea of where I am to sing or make melody from. And that's actually the next idea of how I go about using my voice or my heart. When it uses Ephesians 5:19, if you look in that context, in verse 17, it would say, do not be unwise concerning the will of the Lord, but rather be filled with the Spirit, not drunk, in which is dissipation, but be filled with the wisdom of the Lord. Well, this idea of understanding requires my mind. It's like Philip was talking about. You wouldn't necessarily give the Lord's Supper to someone who has no idea what they're doing, because they've just lost their facilities to focus. I have to be able to think while I'm singing. In fact, my mind is also used when I look at Colossians 3:16. If you look in the verse prior, it talks about the idea of being filled with the wisdom of God. And it says we are to do this by teaching and admonishing one another through psalms, hymns, spiritual songs. That engages my mind, but it helps me to be wiser or learn more about God. So it involves my mind, it involves my voice, but it also involves my heart. Now, the older that people get, their voice tends to fail and they have to use a little bit more of their body strength. Do you know what 4 components that requires when I'm singing to the Lord? If you love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength, that's every aspect required with singing. In fact, the idea of singing with grace in my heart, it makes it individual. Using something outside of me is not me. I must be the vessel that is giving praise to God. In fact, making melody within my heart, individual aspect of how I am to praise God. Let me make sure I got all of this. Okay, now with that said, there is a question that comes up when I begin looking at here is what must happen for me to complete the command. I must use my voice. That is apostolic example from 1 Corinthians 14, verse 15. When I sing, I will sing with the understanding also. But also I must use my voice by explanation of apostolic authority. I'll go back to Philippians 4:9. Can you go ahead and ring the bell, Calvin? Philippians 4:9, that talks about whatever you heard, you learned, you saw, and you read of me, do those things, and the God of peace will be with you. Well, if I consider this idea, what are some of the particulars, just like with the Lord's Supper, where it deals with, does it have to be on a wooden table, or a wooden bowl, or a metal plate? What are some of the particulars that don't make a difference to this command? Well, there's a couple of things in mind. What songs are we going to sing? Do we sing the same songs they sang 2,000 years ago? No. We even sing it in a different language. We don't sing it the same language, but we do sing from the same text material. What about the key of the song or the meter of the song? 4/4, 3/4, 6/8, 12/8. What about mixed meter? Antiphony, I will call upon the Lord. Maybe 4-part harmony as opposed to 2-part harmony, which back in the day, they did have a mixture of we sing in unison and then the men and women sing different parts. That was very common back in the day. What about keeping time? Is conducting violating the command of God as opposed to not conducting? No, that's something optional. What about using a book to read the music from, as opposed to having it on a screen, as opposed to having it on my phone, as opposed to memorizing the song and having it in my mind. We'll talk about a concept here in what little time we have. What about the idea of how many songs we are to sing in the worship? And then here's the big one that most people tend to quibble over. What about having a tuning fork or a pitch pipe? You know, I looked into a majority of all the major music degrees in the land. Did you know you will not find a doctorate of music performance in tuning fork? You won't even find a doctorate of music performance for the pitch pipe. Because musicians understand that a pitch pipe and a tuning fork is a tool that you use to help you to better play the song with the instrument you're going to use. Now, by instrument, I mean piano, drum, trumpet, harp, flute, anything that I can find that in a musician's mind, this is considered a musical instrument. That's exactly what Paul is saying. Those things aren't allowed. That's not your voice. In fact, someone will try to say, well, what if I play for the glory of God? That's what it eventually turns into. It's no longer about you being the vessel that gives praise to God. You begin to focus on your earthly talents, and then it begins to become all about me, myself, and I. We don't have time to look at this, but I would highly suggest that you look into 2 Chronicles 29. 2 Chronicles 29, because someone may say, well, the Bible doesn't say that we can't use musical instruments. I find it of interest that in the Old Testament, it tells me specifically that God did command the children of Israel to use both mechanical instruments of music and their voice in worship in the temple. That's found in 2 Chronicles chapter 25. You know, as I read the New Testament text, I do find this over and over again: sing, sing, sing. You know what I don't find commanded in the New Testament? The use of mechanical instrument in worship to God. So that's all the time we have this evening. I thank you for your time and attention, and you've got the worksheet there, but we're actually going to finish up Noah's story next week, Lord willing. So thank you for your kind attention and wonderful comments this evening.